The room was bustling with laughter, soft clinks of fine silverware, and the warm hum of polite conversation. It was another exclusive event held at one of the finest hotels in San Francisco. The guests, all well-dressed and powerful, filled the room with an air of wealth and prestige. At the center of it all stood Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, chatting with investors and partners, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. He exuded confidence, with sharp features framed by a perfectly tailored suit. His smirk was the epitome of arrogance, like he knew the world revolved around him. Across the room, at the far end near the buffet, stood Maria, the young woman dressed in the hotel's signature uniform. Her posture was impeccable, her smile polite but distant. She carried a silver tray, balancing it with the kind of grace that came from years of practice. She had learned to be invisible, to move unnoticed in spaces like this, where she was nothing more than a servant. Yet, tonight, something felt different. As Maria walked past a grand painting hanging on the wall, her steps slowed. The soft hum of the room seemed to fade as her eyes locked onto the picture. It was a portrait of a young boy, his expression somber but dignified. His clothes were neat, his hair freshly combed. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something familiar. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing as she looked at the boy in the painting. Her grip tightened on the tray she was holding. She had never expected to see that face again. It was the same boy she had grown up with in the orphanage. He was there, in that painting, staring back at her with the same intensity that once haunted her dreams. Her breath caught in her throat, and a strange chill ran down her spine. The painting depicted the boy as an elegant young child, but Maria knew him as a young orphan, someone who had been there with her during the most difficult years of her life. The memory flooded back. The days they spent together in the orphanage, trying to survive, to cling to whatever scraps of hope they could find. The boy was her friend, her confidant, and for a brief moment, he was all she had. But here, in this room, in front of her, he was now someone entirely different, someone rich, powerful, and untouchable. And there he was, smiling down from the painting, now a billionaire CEO. Richard Kesler, the boy who had been the same as her, with no family, no future, just a glimmer of hope. But now, he was the man everyone admired and feared. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. How had he gotten here? How had he risen so far while she had been left behind, doing everything she could to get by? As she stood there, trapped in her thoughts, Richard Kesler's voice broke through the silence, calling for another drink. Maria's hands shook as she composed herself, trying to push the flood of emotions aside. She forced a smile and continued to walk towards the table where Richard sat. She had to carry on, pretend she hadn't seen anything, hadn't been struck by the shocking reality that this man, the boy she had once known, was now sitting at the top, looking down on everyone. She steadied her breath and approached the billionaire. As she placed the glass in front of him, she glanced at the portrait again, her voice steady but her mind racing. "I never thought I'd see you here," she whispered to herself, just loud enough for no one else to hear. Maria had always thought of herself as a quiet observer. As a waitress in one of the most exclusive hotels in San Francisco, she had learned to blend into the background, to disappear into the shadows where no one would look twice. She wasn't supposed to be seen. She wasn't supposed to make waves. But that night, the weight of her past seemed to pull her in a different direction. The moment her eyes met the painting of Richard Kesler, the young boy she had once known, all the walls she had so carefully built around herself began to crumble. Maria had grown up in an orphanage, a place where survival was a daily battle. She had never known what it felt like to belong to a family, to have a home. The orphanage was cold and unwelcoming, a place where children were left to fend for themselves. But Richard, back then just a scared, lonely boy, had been her closest friend, her only ally. They had shared everything, from their dreams of escape to their fears about the future. It was a bond, forged in the fire of hardship, and for a time, it had been enough to keep them going. But then, one day, Richard had disappeared. Maria never learned what happened to him. The years went by, and she moved from one foster home to another, always struggling to stay afloat. She worked hard to earn a living, but life was never kind to her. And now, standing in front of that painting, she realized that the boy she had once known had become someone entirely different. Richard Kesler wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a billionaire CEO, sitting at the top of the world, while she remained a faceless servant in a hotel, trying to make ends meet. It was almost too much to bear. As she continued to serve the guests at the event, her mind couldn't shake the image of Richard, now a powerful man, staring down at her from the portrait. He had come so far, while she had stayed behind, stuck in the same old cycle. It was hard to reconcile the boy she had once known with the man he had become. The rich, powerful CEO who sat in front of her, giving orders, demanding respect, had once been the same boy who had shared her pain. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. She had never expected to see him again, let alone in a setting like this. Maria tried to push the thoughts aside as she moved through the crowd. But as she passed by the table where Richard sat, she caught a glimpse of his face. He was still handsome, his features sharp and confident. He was surrounded by people, all laughing and talking about business deals and investments. But Maria could see the coldness in his eyes. He looked like someone who had forgotten where he came from, someone who had shed the past like an old coat. The old Richard, the boy who had been kind, who had understood her pain, seemed lost to her now. Maria swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had always known that the world treated people like her differently. People like Richard, people with wealth and power, they had everything handed to them on a silver platter. But that didn't make it hurt any less. As she set the tray down on the table and made eye contact with Richard, she could feel a shiver run down her spine. He didn't recognize her. He didn't even seem to acknowledge her presence. But Maria knew. She knew exactly who he was. And in that moment, she felt the weight of the past settle heavily on her shoulders. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a woman who had been forgotten, abandoned, and yet, here she was, still standing. And as she walked away from the table, her mind was made up. This night, this encounter with Richard, was not going to end the way she thought it would. She wasn't going to be invisible anymore. Maria stood in the corner of the room, her tray resting in her hands, but her mind was far from the task at hand. She couldn't stop thinking about Richard Kesler, the boy she had once known, now the billionaire CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. The weight of the past pressed on her chest like a stone. He had risen so high, while she remained trapped in the same life she had always known. She had hoped that time would heal the wounds of her childhood, but seeing Richard again, now so different, had brought everything rushing back. The orphanage, the loneliness, the years spent wondering what happened to him, to all of them. Her fingers tightened around the tray, the silver edge digging into her palm as if trying to ground her in the present. As she moved through the crowd, her heart pounded with a mix of anger, disbelief, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had worked hard her whole life, earning every penny, living from paycheck to paycheck, struggling to survive. And now, here he was, Richard Kesler, sitting at the head of the table with his high-powered friends, a man who had once been her equal, but who had left her behind. She had never expected to see him here, not in a place like this, surrounded by the elite of San Francisco. It felt like a slap in the face. The years of struggle, the constant fight to be seen, to be acknowledged for more than just her job, none of it seemed to matter. Richard had moved on. He had become someone else, someone powerful, someone who didn't need to look back. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he remembered her. Maybe not consciously, but deep down, he must have recognized the girl he had once known. The girl who had been just as lost, just as desperate for a future, but without the luxury of wealth or opportunity. Maria moved past the tables, trying to stay composed, but she couldn't help herself. She glanced back at Richard once more. His eyes were scanning the room, his attention focused on the people around him, the conversations, the deals. He was everything she had never been, everything she had never been able to have. As if sensing her gaze, Richard's eyes met hers for just a brief moment. It was like time stood still. He looked at her, but it wasn't the recognition she had hoped for. He didn't see her. She was just another part of the background, another waitress in a sea of faces he didn't care to remember. The look he gave her was one of polite indifference, the kind you give a stranger, someone who doesn't matter. And in that moment, Maria realized something that shook her to her core. Richard didn't remember her at all. The boy she had once known, the boy she had spent countless nights with in that cold, dark orphanage, had become someone so far removed from her world that she didn't even exist in his memory. The pain of that realization hit harder than any insult. It wasn't just that he didn't recognize her. It was that he had moved on so completely that she no longer had any place in his world. She wasn't a part of his success. She wasn't a part of his story. She was just another face in the crowd, nothing more. Maria felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but she quickly shoved it down. She couldn't afford to make a scene, not here, not now. But inside, the conflict raged. How could he forget her so easily? How could he forget the boy in the orphanage? She had survived years of hardship, and here he was, sitting in the lap of luxury, completely oblivious to the girl who had been by his side through it all. As she made her way to the next table, her thoughts spiraled. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the power. It was about the way people like Richard could forget. It was about the way the world worked, how some people were destined to rise, and others, people like her, were left behind, forgotten, invisible. The anger grew inside her, but so did something else. A determination. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of letting people like Richard define her worth. She wasn't going to let him be the one to decide who she was or where she belonged. And she wasn't going to let him get away with pretending that he had never been a part of her life. Not anymore. Maria's hands trembled as she walked past the long banquet table, her steps slow and deliberate. The sound of clinking glasses and low murmurs from the guests filled the air, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. The image of Richard Kesler, now a powerful billionaire CEO, lingered in her mind. He had risen to unimaginable heights, while she was still stuck in the same place, working for tips and survival. The injustice of it all burned in her chest. She had been invisible to him then, and she was invisible to him now. The rich and powerful had the ability to forget, to leave behind the people who mattered when they were nobody. It was as if everything they had been through together as children, struggling to survive in that cold, unforgiving orphanage, had been erased from his memory. He had moved on, and she was left in the shadows, carrying the weight of the past alone. She had tried for so long to forget that part of her life, to move on, but seeing him again, seeing what he had become, brought everything rushing back. The anger she had buried for so long started to rise within her. She was tired of being a ghost, tired of being nothing more than a background figure in a world that didn't care about her. She had worked so hard, fought so hard to be seen, to matter. But no matter how much she did, people like Richard would always be on top, looking down at her as if she were nothing more than a servant. Maria forced herself to focus on her work as she moved between the guests, taking orders and refilling glasses. She had to keep moving, had to keep her head down. But every time she looked back at Richard, every time her eyes met his cold, disinterested gaze, the old wound inside her seemed to reopen. She had never been given a fair chance. She had never been allowed to rise above her circumstances. And now, here he was, sitting at the table with the world at his feet, while she was just another face in the crowd, a waitress with no name. She tried to push the thoughts aside, but they refused to go away. The bitterness she felt toward him, toward the world, was too much to ignore. As she moved through the room, her eyes accidentally caught his once again. This time, however, it wasn't indifference she saw in his eyes. It was recognition. For the briefest moment, Richard's gaze lingered on her. His eyes flickered, and for just a second, there was a hint of something. Maybe it was surprise, maybe it was confusion. But it didn't last long. He quickly turned back to his conversation, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than a fleeting thought. But Maria noticed. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. He had seen her. He had recognized her, even if only for a second. It didn't matter that he had already moved on from their past. It didn't matter that he had forgotten the person she had been to him. What mattered was that she had not been invisible to him this time. For the first time in years, Maria felt like she existed. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone who had been seen by him, even if only for a brief moment. And that recognition, that fleeting moment of acknowledgement, ignited something in her. It was time for her to stop being the invisible woman. It was time for her to stop allowing the past to define her, to stop letting Richard or anyone else decide who she was or what she was worth. She was not going to let him or anyone else forget her again. Maria stood still for a moment, her heart racing, as the room around her seemed to fade into the background. The soft hum of conversations, the clinking of silverware, and the laughter of the guests all seemed distant now. All she could focus on was the brief exchange of glances with Richard Kesler. It had been a fleeting moment, but it had been enough to shake her. For the first time, Richard had looked at her with something more than indifference. It was recognition, even if it was only for a brief second. He had seen her, really seen her, and that small acknowledgement sent a rush of emotions flooding through her. She was no longer just invisible. He had noticed her. But it wasn't just the recognition that affected her. It was the realization that she wasn't going to let this moment pass by without doing something about it. She had spent so many years letting others define her, letting the world around her dictate her worth. But tonight, things were different. The anger and frustration she had buried for so long began to boil to the surface. She had been stuck in the same place, working tirelessly to survive, always just one step behind, while Richard had soared to the top. But now, standing in this room, with him mere feet away, Maria knew it was time for a change. She wasn't going to be ignored anymore. She wasn't going to let her past or her circumstances hold her back any longer. She took a deep breath and walked back toward the table where Richard sat, her heart pounding in her chest. Her steps were steady, though her mind raced. As she approached, she could feel the eyes of the guests following her, some curious, some dismissive. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was finally going to make herself heard. As she reached the table, Richard looked up, his eyes meeting hers once again. This time, there was no polite smile, no indifferent glance. There was something else there, surprise, maybe, or even confusion. It didn't matter. Maria knew this was her moment. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just the girl who had grown up in the orphanage. She was someone who had fought, who had survived, and who had the power to make a difference. "Richard," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. For a moment, Richard didn't speak. His eyes searched her face, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Maria's heart was pounding, but she didn't back down. "We grew up together, Richard. We were in the same orphanage. You don't remember? You don't remember me?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, but still firm. The room seemed to grow quieter as the tension between them mounted. The guests at the table exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening, but Maria didn't care. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Richard's expression shifted, and for the first time, Maria saw something other than the cold, indifferent CEO. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a momentary flash of the boy she had known so many years ago. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. I don't remember," Richard said slowly, his voice uncertain. Maria couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't about him remembering. This was about her. "Of course, you don't," Maria said, her voice low but strong. "You've come so far, Richard. You've become a man who has everything: money, power, respect. But you've forgotten where you came from. You've forgotten who you were. And people like me, we get left behind." Richard's face changed, his brow furrowing as he looked at her, his earlier confidence slipping. "I didn't forget you," he said, his voice softer now. "I never meant to." Maria shook her head, cutting him off. "It doesn't matter. It's not about you, Richard. It's about me. It's about the people like me who have to fight for every little bit of recognition, every little bit of respect. You may not remember me, but I remember you. I remember what we went through. I remember who we were. And that's what I'm going to hold on to." She turned away, walking away from the table, but this time, she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt powerful, like she had taken control of her own story. She wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else define her. She had taken the first step toward rewriting her own narrative. As Maria walked away from Richard's table, her heart was pounding in her chest. The conversation had been brief, but the impact of those few words lingered in the air like smoke. The room around her seemed to swirl, the chatter and laughter fading as she focused on the realization that had just hit her. For so long, she had been invisible, just another person serving the rich and powerful. But not anymore. Not after tonight. As she walked through the dining area, her mind raced. The words she had spoken to Richard had been raw, unfiltered, and she couldn't help but feel a rush of power as they left her lips. She had stood up for herself, for the person she had once been, for the girl who had been forgotten in the shadows of the orphanage. She had made herself seen, even if only for a moment. The bitter taste of frustration and anger that had consumed her for so long was starting to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity she hadn't known she was missing. She wasn't going to let Richard, or anyone else, dismiss her anymore. As she moved toward the back of the room, she could feel the eyes of the guests on her, the whispers beginning to swirl. She knew what they were thinking. She had broken the invisible barrier that separated the servers from the guests, the ones who had power and the ones who didn't. She had spoken up, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance. But it wasn't just about speaking up. It was about what came next. Maria knew that she couldn't let this be a one-time thing. She couldn't let herself fall back into the shadows. She had to keep pushing forward, keep challenging the world that had always treated her as less than. She had to keep reminding herself of who she was and where she came from, no matter how much the world tried to ignore her. The world may have forgotten her, but she wasn't going to forget herself. As she passed through the door into the back hallway, she took a deep breath. Her body was still buzzing with adrenaline, her hands still trembling slightly from the confrontation. She could feel the weight of what she had just done, and it both terrified and exhilarated her. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to be invisible anymore. In that moment, she realized something crucial. Richard had seen her, even if only for a second, and that had been enough. That moment had shattered something inside her, something that had kept her locked in a cage of self-doubt and fear. She didn't need Richard's recognition to validate her existence. She didn't need his acknowledgement to prove her worth. She had always known her value, even if the world hadn't. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her from her thoughts, and she turned to find one of the other waitstaff approaching her. "Maria, are you okay?" the woman asked, concern in her voice. Maria nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady. But inside, she knew she wasn't the same person she had been when she walked into that room. Something had changed. She had changed, and the world around her was about to feel the shift. She wasn't just going to keep serving drinks and taking orders. She was going to take control of her own story, and nobody, not even Richard Kesler, could take that away from her. Maria felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders as she walked back into the main dining hall, but the feeling didn't last. The room was still full of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of rich, powerful people talking about business, about deals, about money. But something had shifted. Something inside her had changed, and now, with every step, she could feel it. She was no longer invisible. Richard had seen her, even if it was only for a moment, and that recognition had cracked open something deep inside her. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and there was no going back. As she made her way back to the kitchen, Maria felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't the rush of anger that had pushed her to speak up earlier. It wasn't the fear of being ignored or overlooked anymore. She had said what needed to be said, and she had done it without apology. She wasn't asking for validation anymore. She didn't need Richard to remember her, or anyone else, for that matter. The recognition she had received wasn't what mattered most. It was the feeling of standing up for herself, of reclaiming her voice after so many years of silence. As she passed the staff kitchen, Maria caught sight of a few of her co-workers who had overheard part of the conversation. There were no words exchanged, just silent glances and raised eyebrows. Maria felt their curiosity, but she didn't mind. For once, she wasn't afraid to be seen. The world around her seemed different. Even the bustling kitchen, usually filled with the dull chatter and chaotic noise of orders, seemed quieter somehow. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, in the midst of it all, Maria realized she had made a choice. She had chosen to take control of her own narrative. She didn't want to be the person she had been before, quiet, unnoticed, invisible. She wanted to be heard. She wanted to make a mark on the world, no matter how small, no matter how many times the world had tried to shut her out. And maybe, just maybe, she could make people like Richard understand that they couldn't simply walk through life treating others like they didn't matter. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else decide her worth. She was going to decide that for herself. When Maria stepped back into the dining area to collect another order, she found herself walking past Richard again. This time, he didn't look up, but she wasn't looking for his attention anymore. She wasn't waiting for him to recognize her, or for anyone else to validate her existence. She had already done that for herself. As she walked past him, Maria gave a slight nod to one of the servers who was clearing a nearby table. Her eyes didn't linger on Richard, but she could feel his presence. He was just a man who had forgotten who he used to be. She knew what she had to do now. She had to keep moving forward. Richard Kesler didn't have the power to define her anymore. She had stepped out of the shadows, and she wasn't going back. As she walked into the back of the house, Maria took a deep breath, feeling the steady thrum of her heart in her chest. She was no longer the girl who had been forgotten. She was someone who had taken control, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As Maria walked through the kitchen, her thoughts were still swirling, but something was different now. The earlier tension, the frustration, and the feeling of being overlooked, all of it felt like a distant memory. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time in a long time, she felt empowered. She wasn't sure what would come next, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had taken a stand, and for once, it felt like she was in control. As she worked, she kept her eyes on the task at hand, moving between the bustling waitstaff, clearing plates, and taking orders. She could feel the weight of the moment, but she wasn't going to let it define her. She wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else take her power away. That night, as the event came to a close, Maria found herself standing near the exit, taking a brief moment to catch her breath. She felt the energy of the room shift, but she wasn't sure if it was just her or if everyone else felt it too. It was as though something had changed, something unspoken but powerful. People had noticed her, not just as a waitress, but as a person, someone who had a voice, someone who could make an impact. When she passed Richard again, he didn't look at her. But it didn't matter. She wasn't looking for his recognition anymore. She had already given herself what she needed. She had already made her mark. The door to the hotel opened, and cool air rushed in. As she stepped outside, Maria felt a rush of freedom. She wasn't just walking out of the building. She was walking away from the past, from the person she had been, and into a new chapter of her life. She was ready to take on the world, not as the invisible girl from the orphanage, but as someone who had something to say, something to contribute. Maria was no longer just surviving. She was thriving, and nothing, not even Richard Kesler, could take that away from her. As Maria stepped out of the hotel and into the cool night air, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The weight that had once burdened her, the constant struggle to be seen, to be acknowledged, was no longer there. She had spoken her truth, she had taken a stand, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was in control of her own story. As she walked down the street, the bright city lights reflecting off the pavement, she realized that the encounter with Richard had changed more than just her night. It had changed her. She had been a part of his world once, but now, she had her own path to follow. A path that didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. She wasn't invisible anymore. Richard Kesler's acknowledgement didn't define her. Her own strength did. She had faced her past, confronted the anger that had been buried deep inside, and finally found the courage to move forward. Maria knew that her journey wasn't over, but this was a new beginning. A beginning where she would no longer wait for permission to exist, to be seen, to be heard. The world had told her she didn't matter, but she had proven them wrong. She mattered, and from this moment on, she would make sure the world knew it too.